Culture Counts by Serena, Nanda, and Richard L. Worms. Chapter 14. The Contributions of Globalization. Although the historical processes described in Chapter 13 have created a global economic network, the world is not a global village. A global village suggests a relatively small place with easily visited spaces, a place where differences are minimized, a world of screen doors, broad porches, and friendly neighbors. But we live in a world of privilege and exclusion, of rapid change, and of shocking inequality. In this globalized world, some areas are hubs that are easy to reach, are wealthy and powerful, and are in constant communication with each other. Other places are more remote, less in contact with the rest of the world, and reached only with real difficulty. Inequality creates differences beyond those of mere distance. For example, a technology or financial specialist working in Manhattan is likely to have close ties and communicate frequently with colleagues, relatives, and friends living and working thousands of miles away, while having almost no social connections with the urban poor living within sight of his or her office. Our contemporary globalized world is a contradictory place. All around us, we see increasing cultural homogeny: a can of soda, a CD player, cell phones and internet access, and fast food chains like McDonald's pictured in the chapter opening photo. At the same time, the world is increasingly divided, with great disparities in both quality and quantity of life. More than 1.2 billion of the world's population lives on less than $1 a day, while a meal for two at a good restaurant in any American city can easily top $100. In late 2015, the life expectancy in Japan was 83.7 years. In Sierra Leone, it was 50 years, and in Nigeria, 54.5 years. In addition, although many contemporary economic forces favor cultural homogeny, people in many places are insisting, sometimes violently, on their right to preserve their cultural identity or create new identities, intentionally separating themselves from the dominant global culture. Globalization results in many challenges, some of which we examine in this chapter. As we noted in Chapter 8, sharp contrast in wealth and power operate both between countries and within countries. Imagine, for example, that you're in Eastern Africa, where many small clusters of tiny huts dot a dry, barren land. Each cluster contains a group of extended families, all participating in and sharing the work. They have very little money because people make and consume most of their food, shelter, and other goods themselves. They have few roads and no schools, hospitals, electricity, or water supply. But roads pass by the village, bringing news of the outside world. Before long, tropical fruits will be grown here for export. These may end up on the dinner table of a rich family in South America or Europe. Radios made in East Asia, playing music performed by African bands recorded in Northern Europe, are prized possessions. And more people have cell phones and use them regularly. Communication links between remote villages and the rest of the world is increasing, a process that will greatly intensify in the future. Development. At the end of colonial rule, many newly independent nations were mired in poverty, uncontrolled urbanization, population growth, expanded immigration and emigration, ecological disaster, war, and political instability. The gross national income of a nation is the total value of its production, provides a rough estimate of national prosperity, and shows great worldwide disparities. In 2014, the GNI for the United States was $55,000, but 73 of the 208 nations listed by the World Bank had per capita GNI less of $5,000. For 52 of these nations, the figure was less than $2,500. In 2012, a total of 896 million people were living on less than $2 a day and over 2.1 billion on less than $3 a day. In the post-colonial period, during the Cold War, both Eastern and Western blocs saw economic development in poor countries as an opportunity to spread their political ideologies and advance their economic systems. Thus, both of these political blocs provided financial and military aid to poor nations with the goals of creating political allies and stable trading partners, and also to secure sources of raw materials. In addition, some international agencies, wealthy nation governments, and thousands of private organizations involved in development projects truly hoped to bring a better life to the world's poor. The end of colonialism did not mean the end of forced cultural change, foreign intervention, or foreign influence. Instead, nations were brought into ever closer contact, and pace of exchange, both cultural and economic, increased. Modernization theory. The model of progress promoted by Western nations at the end of World War II until the 1970s was called modernization theory. It assumed that countries were poor because they had underdeveloped, backwards economies and were dominated by traditional cultures that opposed the rational thinking demanded by modern society. Modernization theory held that poor countries needed to repeat the historic experience of wealthy countries to become wealthy themselves. Foreign aid from wealthy countries was aimed at building new roads and factories to support rural industrialization, introducing new farming techniques to enable peasants to cultivate cash crops, replacing traditional exchange mechanisms of obligation and reciprocity within the market system, and increasing education to undermine irrational culturally influenced behavior. But poor countries were also encouraged to take loans from governments and banks in wealthy nations. The ability of poor nations to repay these loans was based on expectations of success for the development programs they funded. This kind of development served the interests of both donors in wealthy nations and elites in poor nations. It spread the influence of wealthy nations and made the markets for their products. In poor nations, money from development aid was often used to support an elite lifestyle of exaggerated conspicuous consumption and opened many possibilities for political patronage and corruption. Most of this money did little to improve conditions for ordinary people. Indeed, in many cases, their poverty increased. Part of the reason for the failure of development was modernization theory itself. It not only ignored the roles of colonialism and exploitation that had played in creating wealthy nations, but also ignored the complexities moving in a single pathway from tradition to modernity. Human needs approaches. The failure of most economic development plans in the 1960s and the persistence of poverty, sickness, hunger, and illiteracy in poor nations led to the emergence of a new approach to development, the basic human needs approach. Supporters of this approach argue that development could succeed only if people had access to basic necessities, such as education, pure water, and health and sanitation facilities, which were particularly urgent in isolated rural communities. Basic human needs projects continue to play an important role in foreign aid, particularly aid by non-governmental organizations. But human needs projects lost some prominence by the end of the 1980s, first because although the projects did provide benefits in some communities, they did not create large economic growth, and second because these projects had high overhead expenses and did not generate very much publicity for their donors. Recipient governments disliked them because they disbursed less money than more traditional modernization projects and because groups being aided had relatively little political power. Perhaps most importantly, beginning in the 1980s, political changes in both the West and developing countries resulted in yet another approach to development. Structural adjustment. When the loans to poor nation governments for financing modernization failed to produce wealth, these governments found themselves deeply in debt. At the same time, neoliberalism, a philosophy that holds free markets, free trade, the free flow of capital, and minimum government regulation of the economy, is the best way to increase economic and social development, was gaining strength in the United States and Europe. Neoliberals opposed state control or support of industries and supported only the most minimal aid to the impoverished individual nations. Those opposed to neoliberalism claimed it benefited only economic elites and made the poor poorer, both in developing countries and in the United States. Neoliberalism created a new approach to development called structural adjustment. Under this regime, before, wealthy nations would loan money for development to poorer countries. They demanded that recipients sell off state-owned enterprises, reduce subsidies to local businesses and industries, reduce spending on education, health, and social programs, and open their markets to free trade. Most poor nations protested these policies, but they were often forced to accept them because they were in debt and needed money to operate their governments or increase their security. This was even, or perhaps especially, the case with countries discovered to be rich in oil and natural gas like Indonesia, Venezuela, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, and West Africa. The evidence indicates that the results of structural adjustment are, at best, uneven. For example, a World Bank study of Africa showed that although countries adopting structural adjustment did better than those that did not, the differences were small and probably related more to political than economic factors. So far, structural adjustment policies have increased inequality within nations, and poverty remains an intractable problem. One important organization in various modernization and development efforts is the World Bank. Officially called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank is an international agency that provides technical assistance and loans to promote international trade and economic development, especially to poor nations. World Bank policy has changed since its creation in 1944, embracing at various times modernization theory, basic needs projects, and structural adjustment policies. One current focus on the World Bank is poverty reduction in the poorest countries, with an emphasis on investment for economic growth that will uplift the poor. Like development aid in general, World Bank efforts have been widely criticized for, among other things, the failure of many of its projects. The bank's current neoliberal emphasis has often increased poverty in poor countries, as conditions for loans insisted on reducing money spent for government social services and raising food prices. Because many World Bank projects have been bad for the environment and for public health, such as its coordination with international oil companies, they have been the target for several worldwide protests. Development anthropology and the anthropology of development. As development projects aimed more directly at improving the welfare of the poor, particularly in rural areas, the involvement of anthropologists increased because they saw such projects as both desirable and necessary. This resulted in a new specialty, development anthropology. Development anthropologists are trained to act as intermediaries between development organizations and the recipients of aid. With their interests in local aspects of globalizations, their ethnographically based knowledge of remote communities, and their ability to provide cogent analysis and assessment, they make important contributions to development projects. In 1974, the U.S. Agency for International Development employed one full-time anthropologist, but by 1980, it employed more than 50. In Haiti, for example, anthropologist and aid worker Timothy Schwartz focused on one way Haitians actually live, how they spend, and how they actually think about the issues as a family topics not well understood by NGOs. This lack of understanding resulted in significant waste and failure in international aid donated to Haiti, including the millions donated in response to the horrific 2010 earthquake. The World Bank has also employed anthropologists. Its current president is Jim Young Kim, a medical anthropologist who is a global health expert and a co-founder with Paul Farmer of Partners in Health, which focuses on improving health in the poorest nations through HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis reduction. Responding to criticism that the World Bank prioritizes Western cultural solutions and marginalized local cultural approaches to development, Kim emphasizes the anthropologist's view to amplify the voices of developing countries and draws on the expertise and experience of the people being served. But although Kim's previous public health projects have saved many lives, he has not generally opposed or called into question the neoliberal economic policies and structures that impede solutions to improving health among the very poorest nations. And herein lies the tension in development anthropology. While engaged anthropologists strongly favor development aid, they note that development may actually reinforce the structures of inequality that create poverty in the first place, and they call for programs that empower the oppressed. This may require a direct and pragmatic engagement with existing structures of power that may not appeal to all anthropologists, and perhaps explains why applied anthropology has not made an impact one have hoped for. There are successes, however. In 2008, anthropologists investigating dam construction in Laos, Turkey, and Uganda documented significant failures in the environmental and social programs that accompanied these projects. These discoveries resulted in some substantial changes to the programs. Applied anthropologists help governments and other groups find solutions that are sensitive to local cultural traditions and respond to the people's needs and aspirations. The poverty, disease, and other problems of the poor nations are social facts, aspects of human culture and human society, and thus can be changed. Anthropology can play an important role in this process. As noted previously, Kim and Farmer's work, one of the more successful anthropological efforts, has involved medical anthropologists responding to the AIDS epidemic, which is especially severe in Africa. Unlike in the West, where most cases of AIDS are the result of same-sex relationships and infected needles used by heroin addicts, ethnographic research indicates that AIDS in Africa is mainly due to heterosexual relationships. This requires taking different approaches to the spread of HIV/AIDS, particularly in Africa, for example, with the prevention of AIDS through education, abstinence, and condom use. And although many development projects do not succeed, some do. Child mortality before the age of 5 has decreased by 50% from a generation ago. Life expectancy has increased by 20%, and literacy has increased 25% in the past generation. Businesses that own enterprises and seek to market their goods and services in more than one nation are known as multinational corporations. MNCs bring employment opportunities as well as goods and services to people who otherwise would not have had them. At the same time, they create major and controversial changes in the natural, economic, social, and political environments. Poor nations are particularly vulnerable to MNCs, many of which have yearly budgets greater than those of poor nation governments. For example, in 2014, each of the world's 20 largest MNCs had gross revenues of more than $161 billion, larger than all but about 50 of the 208 countries tracked by the World Bank. The financial power of these corporations enables them to exert enormous influence on poor nations and makes it extremely difficult for these nations to regulate them. In addition, like capitalist corporations, the fundamental goal of MNCs is to return wealth to their shareholders, the vast majority of whom live in wealthy nations. Thus, most MNC profits in poor nations contribute to the economy of wealthy nations. Sweatshop labor. The profits of MNCs are related to sweatshop production. Sweatshops are factories where workers, particularly women and children, are employed for long hours under difficult conditions at low pay. South and East Asia, a sweatshop belt which includes China, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, and Bangladesh, account for 1/4 of the global economy. Much sweatshop production is funneled into the United States in the form of cheap consumer goods. Major brands sold in the United States as well as Europe, including Gap, Marks & Spencer, H&M, and Adidas, produce clothes in places such as Cambodia, where workers are paid 50 cents an hour. Conditions are so severe that they have resulted in mass fainting episodes, and worker protest is often met with lethal violence. The issue of sweatshop safety standards was again brought into spotlight when in April 2013, a textile factory in Bangladesh collapsed, killing 1,129 factory workers, mainly women and children. Workers, manufacturers, building owners, and government officials are conflicted about implementing safety standards. Although most people understand the need for them, they impose an economic price many do not want to pay. The alternatives to unsafe factory conditions and exploitation for many workers may create worse conditions. Most of the workers are drawn from the ranks of the landless poor, and the wages they earn, however small, are often the main support for their families. Furthermore, although public protests and import restrictions aimed at sweatshops may improve conditions and wages, they may also cause a drop in sales, throwing people out of work. Sweatshops are not limited to poor nations. The garment industry in Los Angeles employs about 45,000 workers, many under difficult conditions and very low pay. A 2015 survey by the Garment Workers Center showed that more than 20% experienced on-the-job violence or harassment. Almost half work 10 hours a day or more without overtime, and because they are paid by the piece rather than by the hour, more than half receive less than the minimum wage. The sweatshops of MNCs are often pointed to as the cause for the economic decline in the United States, as more goods are imported from factories elsewhere. Indeed, this has been a major focus in the 2016 presidential campaign. However, the facts suggest some skepticism. Manufacturing jobs are on the decline around the world in a shifting global economy, which service, retail, and other kinds of employment are edging out the employment in factories, which are depending more on machines than on increasing labor for high productivity. Electronics, Apple, and Foxconn. Many Westerners, including Americans, depend on computers, cell phones, and other electronics, but unaware of conditions under which they are made. Foxconn, a Taiwanese company whose main production facilities are in China, assembles about 40% of the world's electronics, employing nearly 1.2 million workers under the poorest conditions. Workers often work 7 days a week. They live in crowded dorms, sometimes with 20 people in a 3-room apartment, and work on assembly lines that run 24 hours a day, while workers stand, crouch, or sit on backless chairs all day. Some stand for so long that their legs swell and they cannot walk. Employees who arrive late are punished, and the workers sometimes have to do 2 shifts in a row. Even with overtime, a worker earns only about $22 a day. Workers who operate machines that polish iPad cases work in an area where the air is filled with aluminum particles that result from the polishing practice. Although Apple and Foxconn knew about the problem of excessive airborne aluminum dust, they did nothing to eliminate it. Rather, with the high demand for iPads, the pace of work became frantic. Airborne dust can be explosive, and one day the Chengdu factory, a series of explosions shook the building, killing 3 and injuring 15. Electronics made from many different companies are produced under harsh conditions, but Apple, as the world's largest electronics company, is involved in many of these issues. Apple outsources 100% of its manufacturing, and though it claims to hold companies with which it does business to the highest safety standards and respect for the rights of the workers, yearly audits indicate that these patterns are consistently violated. Because of Apple's enormous economic power, it can negotiate very low prices from its suppliers. This often means that suppliers cut corners and push their workers harder. Thus far, despite substantial publicity about working conditions, Apple has successfully avoided major consumer resistance, both in the United States and in China. It has done partly by deflecting the blame from itself to its production companies like Foxconn. Under pressure, however, especially by the continuing investigations of the New York Times, Apple agreed to be more active in correcting some of the abuses in its production facilities. NMCs that produce very popular products like Apple devices raise questions about how such products can be produced at a price and American and Western consumers will find acceptable without exploiting workers. Some MNCs, like Nike, have improved working conditions and are also making commitments of social responsibility to the regions in which they are located. Urbanization. In 1950, only about 16% of the total population of non-industrialized nations lived in large cities. By 2000, this figure had reached 40%, and by 2008, more than half of the world's population lived in cities. By 2050, the world's urban population is expected to be about 6.4 billion, equal to the world's total population in 2004. In 1950, 7 of the world's largest cities were located in Europe, Russia, Japan, and the United States, with an average population of about 6.7 million people. In 2015, only 2 cities in these nations made the top 10 list, Tokyo and New York. The average population of the world's 10 largest cities is now 20.5 million. Almost all the urban population growth between now and 2050 is expected to occur in the world's poor nations. Some of the cities that will result will be truly enormous. By 2025, the population of Dhaka in Bangladesh will be almost 23 million, Lagos, Nigeria, almost 19 million, and Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of the Congo, 14.5 million. They will truly be megacities, presenting an enormous challenge in providing basic services to their populations. Urban growth is significantly affected by rural people who come to the cities seeking jobs and other social, material, and cultural advantages. They are forced out of the countryside by high population levels, inability to acquire land, environmental degradation, and sometimes violence. New migrants arrive to urban cities, they often find dismal living conditions. In such places as Bogota, Casablanca, Cairo, Calcutta, and more than half of the urban population lives in slums and squatter settlements. However, in most cases, they also have access to more amenities in these places than in the rural communities they left. As bad as life can be in the places like the slums of Mumbai, for example, most people are there because they believe in their lives and prospects are better than in places they left behind. Urban life can be extremely difficult. Many of the urban poor face hunger, unsafe drinking water, inadequate or practically non-existent sanitation facilities, substandard shelter, and environments teeming with trash. Disease and early death are rampant in the slums of the world's large cities. Also, the experience of the urban poor is not necessarily characterized by the association and solidarity that is typical, for example, of poor immigrant enclaves in the 19th century America. Surviving on the margins of the urban environment is often ruthlessly competitive. As Catherine Bow illustrates for India in Behind the Beautiful Flowers, infighting, crime, and violence are common in deeply impoverished urban communities. People struggle for any advantage that might allow them and their children to escape deep poverty. They face laws that protect the interests of the wealthy and powerful and often force them into illegal activities merely to survive. Frequently, police, justice systems, and religious NGOs do not provide protection and services, but rather extort what little money people have. Yet despite these difficulties, cities continue to grow. This is an indication of the truly deep poverty and desperation that characterizes so much of the rural areas that poor nations and the fervent desire of the hundreds of millions of the world's poor for economic advancement. Development projects must provide adequate services, including water, sewage, education, and healthcare to both rural and urban populations. However, unless life chances and opportunities are improved in rural areas, development will only draw more migrants who will quickly overwhelm any improvements in services, increased economic opportunities. Population pressure. The rate of population growth provides a dramatic index of the increasing speed of social change. About 2 million years ago, our remote ancestors numbered perhaps about 100,000. By the time the first agricultural societies were developing 10,000 years ago, the world's population reached 5 million to 10 million. 2,000 years ago, there were about 250 million people in the world. By 1750, this number had tripled to 750 million. Then population growth really began to accelerate. 50 years later, in 1800, there were 1 billion people. By 1930, there were 2 billion. Since then, the world population has tripled, passing the 6 billion mark in the summer of 1999. In the spring of 2016, the world population stood over 7.3 billion. The world population continues to increase and is expected to rise to more than 10 billion by 2050. In the past 50 years, much of the world's population growth has taken place in poor nations. In 1950, about 1.7 billion people lived in poor nations. By 2050, that number is expected to rise to more than 8 billion, or about 86% of the world's population. Families adapting to globalization. In some cases, high levels mean the subsistence strategies people have used for years can no longer provide enough food. In parts of East Africa, for example, the amount of arable land per person declined 40% between 1965 and 1987. This has resulted in important cultural changes, including land shortage and privatization of land ownership. In Tanzania, for example, up until about 1950, the Waluguru people gained access to land through their lineage, and the lineage head was the powerful figure. Now land must be purchased. This has resulted in the disappearance of the role of the lineage head, and that role is hardly even remembered today. As land has become scarce, women in this matrilineal society have tightened their hold over it, weakening the position of men in marriage to the point where many prefer to migrate to cities to marry. More than 37% of women over 20 are now unmarried, as compared to 15% of men. Population explosion and the search for land and wealth have also pushed people onto land previously occupied only by indigenous groups. For example, between 1955 and 1993, the Agta, a foraging group in the Philippines, was encroached upon the lodgers and migrant farmers. By 1993, the Agta had become landless migrant workers living at the lowest rung of Philippine society. Although nations like China have succeeded in reducing fertility through extreme population control policies, such as the one-child policy, this so skewed the population in favor of boys that many poor rural men cannot find brides. This has led to the importation of women from poorer countries such as Myanmar and Vietnam, and often the physical and emotional abuse of women who are virtually captives in their husbands' homes. The functional, cross-cultural, and holistic perspectives of anthropology help us understand the impact of globalization on social institutions such as the family. Residence rules and family type are economically and politically adaptive, thus patriarchally as functional in traditional hunting and agricultural societies where men work cooperatively, and also functional where males cooperate in warfare. But family structures adapted to traditional subsistence patterns or forms of political organizations may no longer be adaptive under emerging industrial and post-industrial economies of the 21st century. New economies, along with population increase, the spread of global capitalism, changing technology, and women's new economic roles have greatly affected family patterns. As more women enter the paid workforce, the value of marriage has declined. People everywhere marry later, and more people remain unmarried. In Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong, the average age for marriage is now between 29 and 30 years for women and between 31 and 33 years for men. In 2010, a third of Japanese women entering their 30s were unmarried, and many of these will never marry. In 2015, Japanese government survey showed that nearly 40% of single Japanese in their 20s and 30s do not want a romantic partner. Childbearing is also decreasing. In agricultural and herding societies, children are a good economic investment. The cost of raising them is relatively low, and they provide a strong economic boost to the family. But both of these subsistence patterns are shrinking. In urban settings based on an information and service economy, economic benefits go to those who have technical training. The costs of raising and educating children become very high, and the economic benefit of children to their families shrinks. In the United States, for example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates that a middle-income family will spend almost $250,000 to raise a child born in 2013 from birth to age 18 years, not including college expenses. Costs in other wealthy nations are comparable. Families in wealthy nations derive many benefits from their children, but only rarely are these economic. Costs of raising children in poor nations are lower, but the urban areas in which people increasingly live, they are still high, and this has driven family size down dramatically. For example, in Ethiopia, families in the capital city have, on average, 4 fewer children than families in rural cities. To replace the population, women must have between 2.1 and 2.5 children on average. However, the European Union, women average only 1.6 children, and in some countries fewer than this. The number is comparable for wealthy Asian nations. In the United States, the number hovers between 2.1, the replacement value. Even in poor countries, fertility is declining rapidly. Government policies and technological changes also affect family size. Since the late 1970s, China has used a variety of incentives and punishments to encourage families to only have a single child. Many other countries now also promote family planning. Countries like China and India, where male children are more prestigious than female children, the combination of policies promoting family planning, the high cost of child rearing, and the increased availability of ultrasound technology allows people to determine the sex of their children, have resulted in many more boys than girls being born. This imbalance is strengthened by abortion, infanticide, and the neglect of girls. The holistic approach of anthropology highlights the interconnectedness between political, economic, technological, and cultural factors in analyzing globalization and cultural change. Environmental challenges, pollution. Ironically, even though the world's poor consume only a small fraction of the Earth's resources, they also face some of the world's most worst problems of pollution and environmental deterioration. The recent agreement of Climate Pact in Paris and its signing in the United Nations in New York suggests that perhaps the countries of the world are now taking seriously the level of dangerous greenhouse gas emissions. But great challenges remain in all these societies, as well as some skepticism about reaching its goals in an expeditious manner. The energy consumption of the United States alone is more than 14 times the energy consumption of the entire African continent. Given that consumption creates pollution, one might expect that people in the United States would live a far dirtier environment than those in Africa, but this is not the case. Consider the city of Bamako, the capital of Mali, on any late afternoon in the dry season. Most streets are unpaved, and automobiles, trucks, carts, bicycles, and foot traffic have been stirring up dust all day. Because most of the city lacks regular trash pickup or sewage, waste from humans and animals have been churned into the air. People are beginning to cook their evening meal. Many, perhaps the majority, of the city's 1.6 million residents cook on either charcoal or wood fires that consume 1 million tons of wood a year. And smoke from cook fires joins the dust in the air. The combined effect of smoke and dust is like a thick, hot, dry fog. Because most houses are relatively open, lacking glass windows or doors that seal, the dust permeates indoors as well as the outdoors. And Bamako's population suffers. Population contributes to respiratory ailments, malaria, many diseases borne by sewage-contaminated water and air, and high childhood mortality. Compare this with the American city of a similar size, say San Antonio, Texas, a city of about 1.4 million. In San Antonio, most streets are paved and almost all homes have access to safe, publicly maintained water and sewage systems. Meals are cooked on appliances powered by electricity or gas. There is a huge amount of vehicle traffic, but cars and trucks are equipped with pollution-controlling devices. Although San Antonio is not one of the United States' wealthier cities, its population consumes many times the resources than does the population of Bamako. But almost all of San Antonio's population lives in environments that are healthier and far less polluted than Bamako. Population is closely related to the industrialization and globalization. Poor nations, desperate to provide some degree of prosperity to their citizens with limited amounts of capital to invest and limited means of attracting investment from abroad, use less expensive, productive technologies that generally produce more pollution than more expensive, higher technology processes. Therefore, industry in poor nations tends to be dirtier and to pollute more than similar industries in wealthy nations. For example, China has experienced an enormous economic growth but has relied extensively on lower cost, more highly polluting industries, and at least 20% of the Chinese populations lives in severely polluted areas. Trying to solve this problem by installing adequate pollution control in existing Chinese industry would cost $135 billion. The financial power of MNCs may allow them to circumvent national laws designed to control pollution. A good example is oil production in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, where gas flaring releases toxins in the air and releases more carbon dioxide than all the automobiles and other industry in the rest of Africa combined. Gas flaring has been illegal in Nigeria since the 1980s, but continues today because strong and wealthy corporations, using techniques that include bribery and intimidation, are able to ignore and circumvent regulations enacted by the relatively weak government. In the Niger Delta, pollution has created an environmental disaster that has been instrumental in the fomenting violence and civil unrest. Global warming. Global warming is another important aspect of ecological change caused by human activity. Although there are some possible benefits to global warming in places like Northern Europe and Russia, where it may extend for growing season through increased rainfall and reduced fuel consumption for heating, most impacts of warming are expected to be largely negative and fall disproportionately on the poor. Many of the world's poor live in the tropics, where the effects of climate change are expected to be particularly severe. Warming may cut the growing season and reduce crop yields. The intensity of tropical storms is also expected to increase, with devastating effects. Wealthy nations have the resources to respond to climate change. They can build levees to control flooding, move their populations and their industries, and open new land cultivation. Poor nations simply do not have the means at their disposal to do such things. Where survival is precarious today, climate change is likely to precipitate disaster. Political instability. Political instability has had dire consequences for cultures worldwide. Although violent confrontations often occurred in traditional societies and Western expansion was accompanied by great loss of life and culture, people in the past 100 years have unleashed more brutality on each other than at any time earlier in human history. Industrialized and wealthy societies are primarily responsible for this savagery, having created the trenches of World War I, the death camps of World War II, nuclear weapons, and the Gulag. The era since the end of World War II has been particularly devastating for poor nations. In some, such as French Indochina, now Vietnam, World War II faded into wars of independence that persisted until the 1970s. In many cases, traditional people became involved in networks of warfare that drew them into competition between the great powers. Both the United States and the Soviet Union furnished guerrilla movements, impoverished governments, and rebel armies with vast amounts of weaponry. Although the end of the Cold War brought relief to some poor nations, as wars fueled by great power rivalries such as those in Namibia and El Salvador came to a rapid end, rivalries that had been muted by the Cold War reemerged in new violent forms in other nations. In many places, aid from the United States and the Soviet Union and other nations supported strong, centralized, and frequently repressive governments. When the Cold War ended, this support diminished, and governments that relied on it often fell apart. Nations such as Yugoslavia, Somalia, Liberia, and Sudan disintegrated as different groups within them fought for wealth, power, and control. The events in Central Africa, such as Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, have been particularly brutal. By the early 2000s, much of Central Africa was engulfed in what Gerard Prunier called Africa's World War. By the late 2000s, this war was believed to have cost over 40 million lives, and no end is in sight. The widespread increase in violence has led to increasing numbers of people fleeing their homes in search of new safe places. People seeking to leave their home countries are defined in different ways, and this affects their acceptance in countries in which they move to. A refugee is a person outside their home country who is unwilling or unable to return to their homeland due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, a particular social group membership, or political opinion. The migration crises around the world today are based on both those migrating for better lives elsewhere and those claiming refugee status because of violent conflict in their home countries. Syria today is one of the most violent places in the world and the largest source of refugees today, though refugees also come from Afghanistan, Yemen, and other places. Using anthropology, helping refugees. One byproduct of the contemporary political conflicts, human rights violations, and genocides had been the forced migration of people seeking safety from conflicts in their home countries. Today, some 60 million people are seeking refugee status after having to leave their homes, the largest numbers since World War II. Although we assume that wealthier, industrialized nations are the most important refugee havens, in fact, 80% of refugees are sheltered in poorer nations, such as Pakistan and Iran. Germany is the industrialized nation with the highest refugee population, about 500,000, and appears most willingly to absorb the millions of migrants from the contemporary Syrian war compared to other European countries and the United States. Anthropologists are actively involved with helping and advocating for refugee populations, both in the United States and elsewhere. The film Wellfounded Fear, made by anthropologists Michael Camerini and Sherry Robertson, highlights the process by which refugees are granted political asylum in the United States if they can prove a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Any foreigner who comes to the United States may apply for political asylum. In 1998, immigration officers who make the decision to approve or deny political asylum applications approved 13,000 of the 41,000 applications they received. Those seeking refugee status request asylum based on one-child policy in China, a rule that women must be veiled in Algeria, the suppression of political dissent in Romania and Nigeria, the oppression of gays in many countries, and forced female genitalia mutilation in West Africa. Iraqis are one of the newest refugee populations in the United States. driven there by violence resulting in the U.S. invasion of Iraq in March 2003. Unlike 900,000 Vietnamese refugees accepted in the United States after the Vietnam War, as of 2012, the number of Iraqi refugees resettled in the United States was only 84,902. This is a very tiny number compared with the almost 40 million who have become refugees in countries in the Middle East. Many Iraqi refugees have settled in Detroit, where Refugee Works, an organization launched by anthropologists, tries to improve their chances for employment. Another refugee group accepted into the United States in flight from civil wars in Sudan are approximately 25,000 newer. Even the creation of the new nation of South Sudan, politically motivated violence continues, creating a disastrous humanitarian crisis. More than 60,000 Bhutanese of the Nepali ancestry have also become refugees as a result of ethnic cleansing by the King of Bhutan in the 1990s. Anthropologist Catherine Besterman, who carried out the ethnography of southern Somalia, now collaborates with and acts as an advocate for more than 10,000 Somali refugees who have been relocated in Lewiston, Maine, as a part of an American resettlement plan for 10,000 Somali between 2004 and 2006. Besterman teaches at Colby College and designed collaborative projects between Somali refugees and her students, creating videos and digital sites where Somali talk about their lives and their transition to the United States. Besterman and her students also collaborate in making presentations to dispel anti-Somali and anti-refugee bias in Maine and nationally. Other anthropologists, like Carol McGranum, testify for asylum seekers in court. McGranum, who worked in Nepal, provides expert testimony on the current political conditions in Nepal and the cultural aspects of political conflict on behalf of Nepalis seeking refuge in the United States. Anthropologist Mike McGovern uses his ethnographic experience in West Africa to write for the public, explaining that although it is true that some refugees construct fictional narratives to gain U.S. approval, this comes out of a true desperation to flee the dire poverty and systemic violence in their home countries. An anthropologist, Jason DeLeon, writes on the inhumane conditions forced on thousands of migrants, mostly women and children, seeking refuge in the United States from the perpetual gang violence in Central America. Advocating for refugees is one of the very important ways anthropology makes a difference in the lives of real people. Migration. Migration is an inclusive term applied to any foreigner entering, residing in, or leaving a country for any reason. Widespread political, economic, and social instability combined with relatively inexpensive air travel and economic opportunity has led to a huge increase in international migration, particularly of people from poor countries. In 2015, almost 244 million people, about 3.3% of the world's population, lived outside of the countries of their birth. These migrants have enormous influence on both the countries they leave and those where they settle. When migrants leave, they often make their home communities poorer by depriving these areas of their skills and labor. High-skilled workers can earn many times their local wages through migration. It is difficult to convince people to remain poor, unstable countries when the salaries paid for their skills may be 30 or more times higher in wealthy nations. This had led to the brain drain from poor nations to rich nations. But migrants' home communities may gain as well. Migrants provide their communities of origin with connections to the rest of the world, creating a broad network of support for community members. These connections bring information, ideas, products, and perhaps most importantly, money. In 2015, the World Bank estimates that migrants sent $580.6 billion to people in their home countries. Of this sum, $430 billion was sent to poor countries. India alone received 69 billion. In some nations, remittances from migrants constitute a substantial percentage of the national economy. For example, remittances account for 35% of gross domestic product in Tajikistan, 25% in Lesotho, and 23% in Nepal. By comparison, the United States spent a total of $6.43 billion on humanitarian aid in 2015, and a total U.S. foreign aid of all kinds was about $34 billion and accounted for less than 1% of the U.S. government budget. Migrants may profoundly change the countries in which they arrive, increasing the cultural complexity of the places where they settle, sometimes challenging cultural norms and values, providing a pool of inexpensive labor that creates large profits for business, and wealthy migrant labor may also suppress wages in their host countries. Illegal immigrants are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Further, although people in host countries may create programs to attract migrants in times of economic prosperity, they frequently turn against migrants in hard economic times, as happened when the world economy faltered in 2008 and 2009, and is happening to some extent today. Undocumented immigrants are particularly vulnerable to exploitation and deportation, but some nations have offered payment to legal immigrants to return to their home countries. The contemporary anti-immigration trend is illustrated by the increase in xenophobia in both Europe and the United States, the success of the right-wing political parties, and calls in many nations for increasing restrictions on immigration.